Hey, what's up, y'all? It's your boy Preston here, and this is a post fight reaction to Frank Martin versus Nahir Albright, ending to a unanimous draw. To a unanimous draw. Like, I'm just saying, and stuff like that. You know what I mean? Like all I know is it was a unanimous draw because I remember hearing the scorecards and I was like, a unanimous draw. Like, I remember hearing that, before and stuff like that. I forgot what fight it was, and stuff like that. You know what I mean? But I remember hearing that before and stuff like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. You know what I mean? But but yeah, and stuff like that. But overall, this fight ended in a draw. And, this fight was a pretty good fight, in my opinion. Both these fighters definitely brought, a good amount of, technically sounded, fighting and stuff like that. Definitely had a lot of skills going on in this fight and stuff like that. You know what I mean? And overall and shit like that, like it was kind of a mixture of like they were both, that they both were, throwing, hands, and shit like that, and they were both, like, scrapping and shit, and stuff like that, but then at the same time, they were both trying to dial up their information and, and try to, get out of distance and counter punch at distance. But Frank Martin was mainly the one that was dictating, trying to get into the inside because, you know, because, because Albright and stuff like that is more considered like, is more considered like, like a taller type of, um like a taller type of like one, well, like not like tall like that. I mean, overall, I mean, he's only like, it's like because I think, because Frank Martin, he's like 5'7" or something, like Nahir Albright is like, 5 foot, like, like 5'10", I would probably say, and stuff like that, so but there was definitely a height advantage, so overall that's why, Frank Martin had to more, that's why Frank Martin more had to fight from, had to fight from the inside, and also from the outside and stuff, but more bait to getting into the inside because he's more of a smaller fighter and stuff, so that's kind of what he had to do and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing. But overall, this was definitely a good scrap. And overall, Nahir Albright and stuff like that, like, overall, I mean, I underestimated him, but overall and stuff like that, I never really seen a fight of him, like, and stuff like that, like, just like, like I said in my, I think I did say it in my, in my, preview and prediction for this fight, like, I never, seen like, I never really seen like, a fight of Nahir Albright, you know what I mean? Like, this was like the first like actual fight I seen of him, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. Like, that was like the first fight that I seen of Nahir Albright, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? But because in either way, like, I forgot what the card was that Nahir fought on when he fought Kelvin Davis, or whatever Davis brother was, and I know, and evidently, like, I mean, he fought Keyshawn Davis, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing, and I didn't like, and he was actually the person that gave Nahir Albright his first loss, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? Like, he was the first person that gave Nahir Albright his first loss, and stuff like that, and then like, but then after that, I don't know who else beat him, but because all I remember, because I seen, like a picture of, of Nahir Albright and, and Keyshawn Davis, back in the day, like, like in a press conference, or like a weigh-in, and shit like that, back in like, back in like, 2000, and like, I don't even know, and shit like that, you know what I mean? Probably like 2018, because I've watched basically all of Keyshawn's fights, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. But overall, back to this fight, and shit like that, with Nahir Albright, I more never really, kind of, again, seen a fight, and shit, even that Kelvin Davis fight. I remember me seeing the main event of whatever the fight was, but I don't remember what it was. But at the same time, like, I do remember me not seeing the fight between Nahir Albright and Kelvin Davis, but I heard obviously about where, Nahir Albright got jumped by the Davis brothers, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And that's basically how he's known, because I mean, like, nobody, well, I mean, he was also known too, because I mean, he did beat Kelvin Davis, and Kelvin Davis is not too bad of a fighter, and shit like that, you know what I mean? I just don't think he's like, like, I mean, you never really know and shit. I mean, he's still a young fighter and shit like that, you know what I mean? They're like Kelvin Davis, or like, is it yeah, Kelvin Davis, right? Like, but because like with Kelvin Davis and stuff like that, you know what I mean? Like, he definitely shows talent, and stuff like that, and shows that, he knows how to box and stuff like that, but he's a little weak with that stamina, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, but that's the thing and shit, and that's basically how Nahir won that fight, because he more just had better balance. Because I watched the highlights of that fight, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit like that. But overall, he showed his talent and his worth, you know what I mean? Because I mean, Frank Martin is still a good fighter, and shit like that. He still is a very good fighter, and shit like that. Like an extremely good fighter, and stuff like that. You know what I mean? But but like, yeah, and shit like that. But I would like to see Frank Martin. I mean, I would like to see them run it back and shit like that, definitely. And shit like that, you know what I mean? But it's just like I would more like to see them run it back and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And stuff like that, because at the same time, I mean, having a draw with Nahir Albright, like, I mean, that still helps out Nahir Albright, significantly, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. Like, that definitely helps out, Nahir Albright, significantly, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And regardless, win, lose, or draw, if he fought against anybody, you know what I mean? Like, and it's, well, I mean, what I'm saying is that, like, win, lose, or draw in the rematch against Frank Martin, I still think that he showed his worth, that he's a really good fighter and that he should fight against all these tough competition, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? Because he could have won this fight, dude, and shit like that. If he would have won a little bit more rounds and shit like that, in this fight, he could have honestly edged out a victory against Frank Martin, in my opinion, and shit like that, but overall and shit like that, like, you know with the knockdown and shit like that, I mean, a draw was honestly honestly the closest you could really debate anything, really, if you wanted to give it to, Frank Martin, or if you wanted to give it to Nahir Albright, and shit like that, you know what I mean? But I mean, at the same time and shit like that, you know what I mean? If I would give it to somebody and shit like that, you know what I mean, in that fight, I mean, like, you know, I mean, I did, like, I mean, I just felt like the workload, of Frank Martin in the fight, and stuff like that, was, was definitely much, to, like, if it was a victory, to capitalize on that victory, and shit like that, more than if they gave it to somebody like Nahir, if they give it to somebody like Nahir Albright, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? But but yeah, and shit like that, but but overall and shit like that, you know what I mean? Great technical fight, and shit like that. Overall, before that knockdown, I would say I had the, like, because I was actually scoring the rounds and stuff like that, in this fight. And overall, like, I did, have it before that knockdown and stuff, like, because that knockdown happened, like, wasn't it like the like, fuck, I forgot what round it was, and shit like that. Let me look. But yeah, but it was in the 10th round, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing, and shit like that, you know what I mean? it was in the 10th round and stuff like that. You know what I mean? The 10th and final round and shit like that. Because this was only scheduled for 10 rounds and stuff like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. But before that, and stuff like that. I gave Albright, I think, like 3 rounds. And stuff like that. So 6, 7, 8, 9. Yeah, I gave it. I had it like 6 rounds to 3, so 6, 7, 8, 9. Or actually, yeah, so before that round, and stuff like that, I had it 6 rounds to 3 in favor of Frank Martin and stuff like that. You know what I mean? So before that, and stuff like that, I had Frank Martin winning, and stuff like that. And honestly, in the last round and stuff like that, I mean, like, he was honestly winning that round and stuff like that, in my opinion. I mean, it was definitely a competitive round, and stuff like that. You know what I mean? I mean, they were both throwing combinations, and they were both landing punches and stuff like that, but then it's just more of in the middle of, those shots and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And stuff. That's where Albright, like, was in one of those exchanges and stuff like that, caught him with the, like, because it was just, flurries of hooks. Well, I mean, it was like flurries of like, crosses and hooks, but then he caught him with like with the left hook that really severely hurt Frank Martin and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And he had to like, like grab on him and shit like that, you know what I mean? Frank Martin had to like grab on him and shit, prevent, any damage and shit like that, and basically, yeah, and shit like that, so basically, like, that's what happened and shit, is that he basically just like hit him, like, like, because there was flurries, he hit him with that left hook, and then it caught, Frank Martin off guard and hurt him, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And honestly, like, bro, like, if that was somebody that really had power like that, bro, and shit like that, I mean, honestly, I mean, Frank Martin did at the same time, Frank Martin did, play it smart and shit like that, and stuff like that, but like, and overall and shit like that, Frank Martin still has experience from fighting somebody like Gervonta Davis, and shit like that, so overall and stuff like that, you know what I mean? Like, at the same time and shit like that, what was I about to say and shit like that, because he still has experience of fighting somebody like Gervonta Davis. So overall, he still knows how to fight against people with power. But I mean, Albright only has 7 knockouts. You know what I mean? And he got buzzed by Nahir Albright. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. So that's something definitely to consider, and shit like that, because he still got buzzed by Albright, and shit like that, because if that was somebody that really had power, like, let's say even somebody like, because he's at 140, well, I mean, Teofimo, I was gonna say, already spoiled it, Teofimo Lopez, but Teofimo's like is gonna be going up to 147, and stuff like that, that dude might be going up to fucking to 160, I wouldn't be shocked, and shit like that, but yeah, and shit like that, but he's gonna be going up to 147 and stuff like that, and let's see how he's gonna do at 147, to be honest with you. I mean there's Devin Haney there, I mean there's and shit like that, and obviously yeah, and shit like that, you know what I mean? Like, I forgot like who else is, in that division too, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And stuff like that. I definitely know other names and stuff like that, but not that quick on top of my brain. But we got Devin Haney. Obviously we got Brian Norman. Oh, I mean, there is Brian Norman. But yeah, but we could say that for another time and shit like that, you know what I mean? But overall, like, Frank Martin could fight people like, like Shakur Stevenson, and shit like that, he could rematch against Gervonta Davis. Well, no, he's a little too big for Gervonta now, I mean, like, Gervonta still is hanging on to 135, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? But yeah, and shit, actually, let's go and see what fights we got. But do you know what would be a really good fight, though, in my opinion, to be honest with you, would be Frank Martin versus Gary Antoine Russell. I feel like that would be a really good fight, because they both lost before, and shit like that, and they both are still showing high potential with their talent, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing. But yeah, man, and stuff like that. But that would be a really good fight between, Frank Martin and Gary Antoine Russell, because at the same time and shit like that, you know what I mean? And stuff like, they both lost before, but they both are showing again a lot of talent and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit like that, and overall, and stuff like that, like I just feel like they both are kind of they both are fighting for the same, for the same fame and stuff like that, like both these fighters are fighting for the same like fame in the same positioning, and stuff like that, you know what I mean, because they're both in the same position and stuff like that, still trying to fight, to get respect from the community, and stuff like that, the boxing community, and and yeah, and shit like that, and basically both are trying to get their names up, and stuff like that, and that's the thing. Even though Frank Martin is more popular than Gary Antoine Russell, I mean, I'm pretty sure people have seen Gary Antoine Russell fight on, the pay-per-view cards, and, is more getting more familiarized and stuff like that, you know what I mean? But not as much as like what, what boxing analytics like me or other people, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? Like know about him and stuff like that, and that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? But talent wise, they're both fighting for the same positioning, and stuff like that, either way, I mean, overall, Gary Antoine Russell is more of like the actual like full WBA champion, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit. I'm so sorry about all these fucking ads, all these like little ads that's popping up and shit like that, YouTube. So please, like, I don't think you guys are gonna do anything about it, because I mean, I think this happened before, but I really hope you guys don't, copyright my stuff, and stuff like that, because yeah, and stuff like that, because I'm just trying to do what I can do to feed my family, and stuff like that, you know what I mean, and that's the thing and stuff like that, but yeah, man, and shit like that, you know what I mean, so. And yeah, and stuff like that, so overall and shit like that, that's the thing and stuff. So I think that would be definitely a good fight, you know. Um, I mean, there is Dalton Smith, oh yeah, there is Dalton Smith, actually. I feel like that right there, actually, Dalton Smith would actually be a very good fight, because if I'm not mistaken, and shit like that, Dalton Smith is an undefeated fighter. Yeah, he is. He's 19-0. He has 19 wins with 0 losses. Hold on, let's see if I could get out of this ad. There we go. But basically, like, he has 19 wins with 0 losses and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, he has 19 wins with 0 losses, and stuff like that, so overall and shit like that, I feel like when it comes down to with if Frank Martin actually ended up to fight Dalton Smith, in my opinion, I feel like that overall and shit like that, if that actually ended up happening and shit like that, you know what I mean? Um, I feel like that would more, you know, jump Frank Martin's reputation up, in my opinion, than if he fought somebody like Gary Antoine Russell. Mainly because Dalton Smith is really popular over in this country. I mean, Gary Antoine Russell is popular over here, but, not as, sorry about that, but not as much as, as Dalton Smith being popular in his own country. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. You know what I mean? So overall and shit like that, if they did end up fighting and shit like that, that fight would probably be promoted by somebody like, like Eddie Hearn or Queensberry Promotions, and shit like that. You know what I mean? Or Riyadh, and shit like that. Riyadh can also promote, but I mean, but usually this would be like a domestic fight, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And stuff like that, so it wouldn't really be like, well, not like domestic like that, and shit, not a super, but like at least, in a way compared to what fights like, Riyadh like make, I mean, Riyadh can still make fights like this, it's just, but like, it's just more of like, Riyadh more likes to make fights that are like, really big primetime fights that like everybody will watch. It's like every here and there they'll make fights and stuff like that. For more of like smaller domestic fights. And stuff like that. Like something like Frank Martin versus Dalton Smith. And stuff like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. You know what I mean? But overall and shit like that, you know what I mean? That's definitely a really good fight, and stuff like that, for Frank Martin and stuff like that, is Dalton Smith, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? Because Dalton Smith and shit like that, you know what I mean? Again, he's an undefeated fighter, man, and that's the thing and shit like that, Um, let's see how many knockouts he has. But yeah, 19 wins, 0 losses, with 14 wins coming by way of knockout. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. Overall I don't name the draws no more, unless if they actually have a draw, and shit like that. So that's something that I'm not gonna be doing on this channel anymore, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, like if it happened it would have been on accident, but either way, 19 wins, 0 losses, with 14 wins coming by way of knockout. And he is a 5-star on BoxRec. And he also knocked out Subriel Matias, and shit like that. And honestly, they might be running that back, though, and shit like that, actually. And I forgot about that he was doing that fought against Subriel Matias, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, and he won that fight, but I want to rewatch that fight, and stuff like that, because it looked like Subriel was winning until Dalton just started hitting him with a bunch of power shots, and shit like that, and then basically like that's when Subriel started slowing down, and shit like that, you know what I mean, and then he got knocked out, and shit like that, like I actually would like to see that fight again too. And shit like that. There's several fights of what can happen, and shit like that, for that, but I'm just saying for Frank Martin, that's definitely a fight, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And overall, if he did end up fighting Dalton Smith, that would definitely bring up his career, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit, because like, if he won the fight, because, I mean, Dalton Smith is a really fucking good fighter, and I'm just saying, like, who knows of who would win that fight? And realistically, genuinely, in my opinion, I really don't know who would win that fight, because it would be a really close fight, and shit like that, a very, like, it would be a good fight, and shit like that. But I just, at the same time and shit, like, like, that's the thing and shit, but it just, if Frank Martin ended up winning that fight, and shit like that, that would definitely bring back his career back to where he was before, in the, like, more actually better than what he was the first time in his career, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. He's gonna be definitely, you know, definitely a lot better, because even though with that loss, but it just, he's progressinated, fought more tougher opposition, and then if he actually ended up beating Dalton Smith, then like that would really bring back his career. But I mean, he would have a really tough fight to go against, if to win that fight. And who knows if he would end up winning that fight, because who knows if that fight would even be promoted by somebody like Al Heyman or something, or like, and who knows if he could get a fight like that, a main event fight like that, on Riyadh. I mean, honestly, he can, though, because I mean, Frank Martin is more of like a bigger name, though, and stuff like that, so I mean, honestly, he could get a main, honestly, you could get a main event, honestly, in my opinion. The card might not be all that crazy, and that's the one thing, with Riyadh fights and shit, is that, like, they want their cards to be like stacked to like from top to bottom, and shit like that. They want their cards to be stacked. And but overall, I mean, like, stack the card, and overall, like, regardless if Frank Martin and Don Smith, were the main event, I mean, that would still bring eyes, you know what I mean? And that would still bring a lot of viewers, because I mean, because both these fighters are very popular and shit like that, you know what I mean? And let's say if the fight actually did happen in the States and shit like that, you know what I mean? Overall and shit like that, you know what I mean? Like, if that fight did happen over in the States and shit like that, like, that would bring a lot of, like, people to that fight, a lot of, like, electricity to that fight, you know what I mean? Because it's just, like, you got the American fan base, and then you got the British fan base. You know what I mean? Like you like the Brits are gonna show up, bro. You know, like because them Brits like when they're when they're fighters and shit like that are fighting, and stuff like that, like especially in the United States for a big fight, like you're gonna definitely see a lot of Brits, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. Specifically if it's the USA, and shit like that. Even though like USA and Britain we cool with each other, I think we in NATO, like actually I don't think we should bring politics into this and shit like that, you know what I mean? But I'm just saying of that part, and shit like that. Like regardless, I mean I don't want nothing to happen to any parts, and shit. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. And shit like that, and all, prayers and everything. I don't want nothing to happen. But yeah, and shit like that. You know what I mean? But either way and shit, both those fan bases colliding, and then it would bring a lot of people to that fight. You know what I mean? And then overall, you would have a lot of British fights versus Americans, and stuff like Americans versus British fights and stuff like that. You know what I mean too. Also, and yeah, man, and shit like that. So it definitely bring a good fight, man. I ain't gonna lie, and shit like that for sure. But for Nahir Albright, I mean, there's several fights of what he can fight. I mean, the one that really makes the most sense for Nahir Albright, to be honest with you, is a rematch with, Frank Martin. Overall, I mean, like realistically speaking, I mean, I would like to see a rematch, and shit like that, more of two, and shit like that, because it was a draw. I mean, and I would like to see what Frank Martin would do, would do against somebody that he drew against and shit, because if this was back in the day and this was a tough fight, and shit like that, like that's like an automatic rematch. Like nowadays and shit like that, like people kind of like more just kind of just like be like, oh, like it was a tough fight, but I know I can beat him like the second fight. Let's just not fight him and shit. Like, nah, bro, and shit like that. Like I'm just saying, like I want to see a rematch and shit like that. You know what I mean? Because overall, because Nahir Albright, he can actually, I actually know now he can actually win. You know what I mean? And overall, in the next fight, like I do think it would actually be a lot more competitive in the next fight. To be honest, so there's definitely a lot more, like higher, you know, expectations when it comes down to that fight. So I mean, I feel like that fight definitely more matters is a rematch in my opinion, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? Look at Adam Azim though, bro. Like that boy is moving up the rankings though, bro. And stuff like that, you know what I mean? But overall and shit like that, there's also people like Keyshawn Davis, uh, that he can rematch, and stuff like that. If I'm like, not mistaken and shit, like let me go see if they actually fought. But actually that fight between Keyshawn Davis and Nahir Albright, like that ended in the no contest actually, and shit like that. And I don't know, man. Like, do I remember that fight? Like, I don't really know, and shit like that. You know what I mean? And I don't really know and stuff like that. You know what I mean? But but yeah, I don't really like. I know it happened obviously, but I'm just saying I don't think I remember that fight to be honest with you. But either way, that's definitely a high anticipated fight because also with the controversy of of Nahir Albright getting jumped and shit like that, So I mean, there's definitely Keyshawn Davis, but I mean, I feel like Keyshawn is definitely levels over Nahir Albright in my opinion, and would definitely make it look easy work against. Well, I mean, Albright did look good against Frank Martin, but but that's not Frank Martin in my opinion. If like that's not Frank Martin, like that would be Keyshawn Davis of who he would be going against. So yeah, and shit like that, But let's see who else there is over here. Um oh yeah, yeah. And then also like I said, there's also Kenneth Sims, and shit like that. You know what I mean? Kenneth Sims and shit like that. You know what I mean? Like Kenneth Sims would definitely be a good fight because Kenneth Sims is kind of starting to kind of jump down the ladder now instead of going up the ladder. And shit like that. Because obviously with that loss to Oscar Duarte and shit like that. Not saying Oscar Duarte ain't a good fighter. He is a good fighter, and shit like that. You know what I mean? But I mean, at the same time, I mean, like Kenneth Sims could still bring his career back, and overall, like, he would most definitely bring his career back, and shit like that. You know what I mean? And and that's the thing and shit like that. He would definitely bring his career back and shit like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. You know what I mean? Um, and yeah, and shit like that. He would definitely bring his career back with that fight, with if he fought against Kenneth Sims, if Kenneth Sims fought against Nahir Albright, because overall, like, because Kenneth Sims is just, again, with that loss to Oscar Duarte, but overall, it's just, like, I just feel like he just thinks he's a little too good for what he actually thinks, for what, like, he actually thinks he is, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit, like at least, like, it just, at least in my opinion, and shit, because ever since he beat Elvis Rodriguez, he kind of just, like, just been, he's fun a little bit after that, but then he's kind of just lived up to just the hype of just, oh, I'm this, I'm that, I beat, Elvis Rodriguez and this and that and shit like that, more than actually, like, you know, more than actually, like, still being dedicated and shit like that, you know what I mean? And, oh shit, and that's the thing and shit like that, with, well, let's see if I could get this. There we go. And shit like that, you know what I mean? But basically that's the thing and shit like that, when it comes down to it and shit like that, you know what I mean? But and overall, who was I talking about? Like with Kenneth Sims, like, it just, I'm just saying, it's just been kind of a whirlwind, man, for this dude, just been inactive as fuck, and it just, when he went into that ring against, Oscar Duarte, is just, this dude, like, couldn't find any way to getting away from the Oscar Duarte. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. But honestly, Duarte again is a good fighter, but it's just at the same time, he just looked horrible in that fight. You know what I mean? Like if I'm not mistaken, like, did he get stopped by Duarte? No, he didn't. I don't think he did get stopped by Duarte. Like, and shit like that. But he didn't get stopped by Duarte and shit like that, you know what I mean? But he just got dominated by Duarte. And I was fucking really was favoriting Kenneth Sims in that fight, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And I was really favoriting Kenneth Sims in that fight, and it just ended up like that, you know what I mean? But overall, if he fought against Nahir Albright, that would definitely bring his shit up, bring his career back. If he fought, and overall, stylistically speaking, that right there would be a really entertaining fight, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And I'm just saying and shit like that, and honestly, I feel like, honestly, to be honest with you, I think Nahir Albright should honestly fight Kenneth Sims, because they both are kind of in the same position, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that, like, if they don't get the rematch with Frank Martin, I feel like he should target Kenneth Sims, in my opinion, and shit like that, you know what I mean? Because Kenneth Sims, like, again, it's just like both of you guys are in the same positioning, you know what I mean? And if he won that fight against Kenneth Sims, and if you win against which is a name fighter of Kenneth Sims, and if you win against a fighter that's a good name and shit like that, you know what I mean? And if you win against a fighter that's a good name and shit like that, you know what I mean? Like, that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? Like, that's gonna really, regardless of who wins this fight, to be honest with you, I feel like that would bring their careers back, and shit like that, and would, like, well, with Nahir Albright, it would more help his career, but then with Kenneth Sims, it would more bring his career back, you know what I mean? Because I feel like people are kind of like, like, just kind of just, you know, not really like paying attention really to Kenneth Sims anymore. But it's also, again, this dude has been inactive as fuck. So yeah, and shit like that. So that's a good fight right there, Kenneth Sims, and shit like that for Nahir Albright. There's Keyshawn Davis, and shit like that. And then of course there's the rematch with Frank Martin. And that's the thing. And then with Frank Martin, I feel like that, if it's not the rematch with Nahir Albright, and shit like that, which I feel like, he should, in respect should, give, a rematch to Nahir Albright, and shit like that, just to kind of just to, you know, just to fight him again, and shit like that, just off of respect. But if not, I feel like the only fight to really to go to is Gary Antoine Russell, or the fights to go to. I mean, there's different fights to go to, but the two fights, in my opinion, that I think that he should go to is either Gary Antoine Russell or Dalton Smith, and shit like that. You know what I mean? Honestly, I feel like he should start off with Gary Antoine Russell, only because if that fight does happen, it would be in the States, or obviously, if it's on with Riyadh, it would be in Saudi Arabia, or it would be, somewhere else and shit like that. Actually, no, not all the time. It's actually in Saudi Arabia. That's more whenever the British fighters want to fight somewhere else, I think, shit like that. You know what I mean? Like, or did we ever, fight over in or did we ever fight, in anyways and shit like that, you know what I mean? But I'm just saying and shit like that, so yeah, man, and shit like that, so overall that would be in the States and shit like that, you know what I mean? um it would, like, like, it would, like, regardless, like, both these fighters, like, would get the same benefit of the doubt. It would be an even fight, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing. So if it was for anything out of Dalton Smith and Gary Antoine Russell, I would pick Gary Antoine Russell. But then overall, either way, shape, or form, on both sides of the spectrum, or both sides of, of the fighters and stuff like that, with Nahir Albright side, with Frank Martin side, I just feel like that they should have a rematch against each other, and stuff like that. You know what I mean? Because Nahir Albright was a big time underdog in that fight, and he just went out like that, and shit, and made that fight a draw, and stuff. And that was the same thing, and stuff like that. You know what I mean? Of what happened with Gervonta Davis versus Lamont Roach Jr., and shit like that. Because Lamont, because, like, well, actually, no, those odds were actually pretty close, actually, and shit like that. Or they, yeah, it was actually definitely more closer than what the odds were with Frank Martin and Albright, and shit like that. You know what I mean? And and that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? But yeah, man, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And overall and shit like that, um that is going to end this video and shit like that. Hold on, I'm gonna end this video over here. Hold up. We're gonna move rooms. But yeah, but overall, that was definitely a tough fight between both fighters, and stuff like that. You know what I mean? And overall and stuff like that, I give my hat off to both these fighters, and yeah, and stuff like that, and but you know, but yeah, also credit to the ref too, and stuff like that. You know what I mean? He definitely did his thing, and shit like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. And yeah, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? But he did not like when those fighters were clinching though, and shit like that. Like, anytime those fighters were clinching and shit like that, you know what I mean? Like, that's where, like, the ref was like, and he didn't want to share no room. Like, it was almost like this ref didn't want to, like, see, like, a board. Like, he just wanted to see these dudes just throw their hands, like, it wasn't even anything about safety. He just wanted to see, honestly, a knockout, to be honest with you, and shit like that, like, and that's the thing and shit like that, but but yeah, but credit to the ref though, because I mean, honestly, he did do his job and he did do his thing, and shit like that, you know what I mean? But yeah, and shit like that. But overall, thank y'all for watching this video. Make sure you guys like and subscribe. I'm Preston. Peace out, man.